that. 82% of onshore oil production took place in the red states, 88% of gas, 89% of coal, 73% of refining nameplate, 72% of corn. Should I go on? I'll stop. Most of the energy that folks are talking about is in states that probably weren't going to vote for those candidates anyway. So it's a relatively safe bet. The top 15 onshore oil producers, 12 of which are red states. In the aggregate, 192 electoral college votes. Take out the blue states, it's 123. Can you win the election with that? Yeah, you can. But what about the Trump administration? Trump administration that liked oil and gas still went after steel tariffs. And I want to just mention that that particular choice wasn't that helpful to oil and gas. What did the steel tariffs do? Well, they were designed to increase capacity utilization at domestic steelworks, and they did. They drove capacity utilization up, again, same interval, January trailing 12 months to August. I know I've said it a bunch, but I have to say it again because you're economists. 74% January 18, up to 81% August 2019. And total steel import volumes fell 19%. And oil country goods and tubulars down also 19%. So obviously proportional, right? Well, yes and no. When we look at what actually happened, those drilling and pipeline steel imports that were subject to tariffs, right? Total steel subject to tariffs fell 25%. But the oil country goods and tubular subject to tariffs rose 25% because of the quotas that you mentioned, because they couldn't get the stuff that they used to get from the places they used to get it, so the oil industry had to pay more for it. And you ask, how can this be happening, dominance president? And the answer is because there are, as Horace said, higher political priorities. The oil and gas share of personal consumption expenditures fell 15% over the course of the last 10 years. The era of scarcity could return. The era of scarcity perceptions in Washington is essentially over. So let me close with where we can go next. There are other kinds of trade war. If that Great Recession aftershock I mentioned is to just abate suddenly, it would be great news, but I wouldn't hold my breath. Across the Atlantic, there's a country or two that has mentioned from time to time that they're taking a significant economic hit pricing carbon on an industrial basis in their power sector. And they'd like other countries that do business in their countries to take that hit as well. Ursula von der Leyen, the incoming European Commission president, has committed to carbon border adjustments, although we'll see if that actually happens, as step one of equilibrating that disequilibrium. We could move, in short, from trade war to carbon trade war. And there's virtuous aspects on a relative emissions life cycle basis that the US can celebrate, but there's other things that are less easy to celebrate. Because overall, the more we encumber global trade with the freight of tariffs and the frictional costs of computing life cycles every time we want to sell or buy anything, the more we undercut the demand, that very same constraint that both Oliver and Horace mentioned. The demand is the only thing that constrains what we can do. So that's where we stand right now. It's not an incredibly auspicious picture. We have headlines today that some of those tariffs could potentially fall away, or maybe they won't. I'm not a Trump whisperer. I do not purport to be able to predict what will come out of Twitter in the next several minutes, hours, or days. I can only promise that I'll do my best to try to understand it. Thanks.
That was excellent. Thank you, Kevin. As moderator, I'm going to ask each of you a question and then open it up to the floor. Where shall we start? I guess, Oliver, I'd like to ask you, the elephant in the room really is, we've got this picture of very fungible oil markets, things moving around, despite the fact that China's ceased buying, as Kevin cited very elaborately. On the gas side, we don't have that depth and liquidity in the global market. It's much more nascent. How do you see that evolving? If this is entrenched and China is not the buyer going forward, how do you see the market evolving to reach the projections that you've outlined?
Sure. So today we actually are selling CNPC cargoes at our Sabine terminal in Louisiana, and they haven't decided not to take any of those volumes. I don't actually know the exact jurisdiction. I should have come prepared with that information, because there is now a 25% tariff on LNG imports into China, but they have continued to take the volumes that they signed up for, and they can easily, if they want, to place those in alternative markets. Europe is a very efficient sink for LNG, as long as it's priced appropriately, but we really haven't seen much of an impact there. I will tell you where we have seen an impact is, look, in our discussions to sell more LNG to China, those have certainly taken a back seat with the advent of the trade war. We're continuing our relationships and our dialogues, and we're putting in place a business model that lasts multi-minute administrations, and we think in terms of years and decades. So we're highly confident, but in summary, there certainly has been an impact, and we would have done more business with China in the last 12 months had the trade war not been on the forefront and an issue, because that is preventing additional business from getting done. But again, I really believe that LNG is fungible, and if China's off limits, yes, that has some negative implications, but at the end of the day, demand will grow. China may have to go elsewhere, but additional U.S. cargoes can fill the void in markets that do not bear the same type of constraints.
Thank you. That's great. And to reflect, that's quite a milestone for the U.S. And a lot of credit to Cheniere, which has been at the leading edge of changing the business model and the pricing models for LNG globally. Horace, so the Saudi attack, I think, is on a lot of people's minds. We're just a couple of months away from that. And it had initially a really big global impact. People, we saw day one an $8 move, and then as they signaled that supply was coming back, much less. And here we are, 6-8 weeks removed, and the market has basically washed it away. And we've seen crude flow, and we've seen crude price differentials, the prices between different crude oils of different locations and qualities around the world, move to some relative extremes. What do you think? Do you think, are we in this sustainable equilibrium, or do you think the market maybe is not fully discounting the risks of whatever may come next?
I get two of them here.
All right.
It's awfully hard to know, and it's clear that the market believes that there is a lot of crude oil out there. OPEC has cut back 3 million barrels a day of production, plus 2 million barrels a day that we sanctioned. Part of the realignment in crude flows that happened simultaneously with the Saudi attack was our sanctioning of tankers. And so we took about 20-25% of the VLCCs off the market, the U.S. did. So there's a lot of moving parts, and then you couple that with IMO, and that's had a real profound impact on individual crude stream values just in the last month, especially. We've started to see that play out. So one thing is clear: there's lots and lots of crude available in the mind of the market, and plenty to backfill. I don't know what it would take, actually, to see a big spike. And so I think commentators have suggested that kind of an attack on Saudi Arabia 10 years ago would have been a $50 move and would have lasted for quite some time. And now it's a $6 or an $8 move, and it lasts for 10 days. So I think this notion of permanently being in an environment of energy abundance, we're there. And so given the other folks that are talking at this particular conference about how demand is going to be less in the future, for petroleum than it is today. You can't see any other place for this to go.
Great answer. Thank you. And Kevin, that was an awesome talk. I'm going to ask you a very open-ended question because you've already opened the door to what might come next. But as you see both what's happening on the administration side, the potential for reading the political wild cards of where things could change in the next year, are we past a point of no return, or do you feel like, especially in energy trade, do you feel like it's embedded, could a change of administration, would it be a backsliding? Would it push us further in this deglobalization direction? How do you read the tea leaves on both the domestic regulatory changes as well as the trade pattern changes that have started to, especially after 3 years of it, be a lot more enduring here?
Thanks for the question. One of the dynamics that I didn't mention at all is sanctions. It came up with a couple other speakers. And the common element between tariffs and sanctions is they're both forms of economic force projection, right? They're both substitutes for essentially military confrontation that we've undertaken more readily and with greater effectiveness than we might have done a decade or 2 decades ago. Well, the readily part has to do with political mores of the moment, right? America's war fatigued. But the effectiveness has to do with the interconnectedness of the global financial system. So ironically, it is because of globalism and globalization that sanctions and tariffs work so well as weapons. And if they start to weaken globalization and globalism, then their effectiveness would be attenuated. Now, the imprint of how you transact, limiting the flow from supply sources to demand centers, is a bit unusual. It's a template for how things could look when we start wondering about attributes of the barrels or of the cargoes, and start asking about carbon chain of custody issues, if we get to that. But even if we don't, as long as we're in a situation where we're actively relying on these financial economic force projection tools, these basically freaking out the banks is why this works, right? The banks are very risk averse, and as soon as they think there's going to be a problem, they're out. As long as we're still in an interconnected world, then things can switch on and they can switch off pretty readily. At what point do people say, I'm not buying from the US, or I'm not using dollars anymore because it's just too risky? We're a long way from that point, right? As long as the price is right, it's good. But when we make the price wrong with economic force projection, the market goes elsewhere very quickly.
Excellent, thank you. I'd like to open to the queue here, please. And if you have questions, please queue up.
Lior Yaroslavich with Chevron. One LNG question, one NGL LPG. First wave of LNG was very successful. Second wave has some disadvantages, being some of them greenfield, reluctance of buyers to sign long-term contracts. And even though some developers have been very creative with pricing mechanisms, FIDs are not happening at the hoped rate. So in your opinion, what would it take to go get those FIDs, more liquidity in JKM, or what would it take? And the other question is around LPG, NGL export. I think the most common view is that a lot of it is going to clear in Asia. It's really tricky to model because nobody drills for NGLs, right? They come as they drill for oil or gas, and it's really hard to model. The petchem substitution, it's also really hard to model. So any risk to that view that long-term everything is going to clear in Asia, and then, you know, if the rate of growth in NGL production doesn't meet or exceeds the rate of growth in demand in Asia?
I'll take it first. On the NGLs, if it doesn't all clear in Asia, then it'll get burned for fuel in the U.S. And it's sort of the last alternative is to just burn it. And so you can drive the price down to, BTU equivalent in the natural gas stream, which of course is painfully low today. And so we've seen that happen from time to time in the past when you had an excess of NGLs. and a very low gas price. You just burn the NGLs, and that's what we can do. They're clean burning, not quite as clean as methane, but it's right up there and certainly better than some of the solid alternatives.
So it does work. I wasn't sure if it actually works. So on the, to answer your question, the first wave of LNG in the U.S. was, I would argue, the paradigm shift in the industry. So historically, before U.S. LNG emerged, I viewed it as sort of a supplier power type of marketplace where, the buyers didn't have a lot of optionality. The project gets developed, and the price is pretty much what's going to make the supplier happy. U.S. LNG emerges on the scene with a very large, low-cost resource and an inherent additional level of flexibility that didn't previously exist, because if you look at LNG projects outside of the U.S., it's a stranded gas resource that is then connected to the marketplace via LNG, and the economics only work if the resource gets developed and the buyer ultimately is required to take the LNG. With the U.S. basically structure where you have this disconnected upstream marketplace that has its own independent price signals, the buyer of U.S. LNG is basically picks up this inherent flexibility. So the way our contracts work is that a buyer makes a payment to us irrespective of use that covers a return on and return of capital and justifies the project and all the work and hard work we put in to develop the project. And then if they want the LNG, they can take it. If they don't want the LNG, they don't have to take it. And if they take the LNG, they pay us, for example, if they're picking it up at our dock, 115% of the NYMEX price. But there is no obligation to lift those cargoes. So this large U.S. resource, this inherent flexibility in the commercial offering was the paradigm shift in the industry, and it has now shifted the power away from the supply side to the buyer. And as a result, you've now seen a lot of international projects sharpening their pencils, and the increased competition, which is obviously going to accrue to consumers and buyers in the form of lower prices, is starting to emerge. And so the first wave of LNG, you had a lot of buyers filling up on a Henry Hub indexed price in their portfolios, and now we certainly expect to see more long-term contracts, but there was just this massive growth within the U.S., and now you have all these other international projects competing that want to develop their stranded resources. So if we look at Mozambique, for example, there's 100 TCF of low-cost stranded gas and a lot of deep-pocketed majors that would love to develop those resources. And in order for them to be competitive, right, they have to have terms that 10 years ago, they might not have accepted. So my broad answer is the marketplace is becoming much more competitive on the supply side, and the U.S. will ultimately grow, and we feel very confident more long-term contracts will be available to support the type of development program that is needed in the U.S. and the type of revenue visibility that a developer like Cheniere Energy needs in order to get comfortable going out and raising and spending, multi-billion dollars of capital. So, long story short, increased competition globally. There is lots of gas, as I mentioned on my slide. Russia has large and broad ambitions. You have Mozambique, and then now the Qataris have stepped in and said, 5-6 years ago they had a moratorium and said they weren't going to develop any more of the North Field. Perhaps because of their concern of what Iran might do, because they share the field. But anyways, they've lifted that moratorium and they've become much more aggressive. And I attribute all of that to the fact that the U.S. has this very large, flexible resource that that is putting in a great deal of pressure on the supply side and forcing competition that ultimately it will accrue to the consumer.
Tim Fitzgerald, Texas Tech. I have a question. Thanks for the comments about sanctions, because I have a kind of a two-part question. One is about policy, both on the trade side and on a foreign policy sanction regime. I was wondering what your views might be going forward, how that policy might evolve. You talked a lot about how markets have reacted to the policy developments to date, whether you thought the policy would eventually snap back or evolve in some other direction. And the second part of the question is then how will markets react to the policy developments you foresee in both the trade and the sanction spaces? Thank you very much.
Great questions. So to some degree, the economic context sets constraints around the realm of the possible for this sort of economic force projection. Because what better time than after a tax cut to start a trade war? What better time than when the U.S. has become a massive exporter of crude oil than to target producer nations with sanctions? And looking ahead, what better time than when oil prices are low and energy wallet share is declining to start a carbon trade war, right? The economic context really matters. The next administration in the United States, if it flips over, could find itself in an accommodating price environment where the domestic economic ramifications are relatively minimal for continuing the status quo. We've heard candidates say things like, well, I would look again at the tariffs. I might lift some of them, but they're not immediately saying I will surrender advantage. When you look at the nature of the Iran sanctions, only Cory Booker out of the Democratic Party candidates has said that he wouldn't immediately go back into the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. Everyone else is lying. They're not going back into it either. That deal was not just reviled by President Trump and a number of Republicans. It was substantially reviled by most of Congress. There was a bill passed in 2015 called the Iran Nuclear Agreement Review Act, which rigged the game so that the deal went into force if Congress couldn't override a veto of a resolution disapproving of the deal. What that meant essentially was that they needed at least 34 supporters in the Senate, and they got them, barely. They got 41. Congress doesn't love it, America doesn't love it, and no one's running back to it. The sanction status quo remains in force, in short, until such time as a new deal is negotiated. That has less to do with endogenous economic circumstances here in the US, because there's two parties to that negotiation. And I think when Iran feels that it's got enough negotiating collateral, whether it's in the form of uranium or whether it's in the form of aggression that the region fears, they'll probably come back to the table and try to strike a bargain. But that might not be soon. The last thing I'll say about that is that the idea of going from endless kinetic conflict to endless economic conflict is not a good one, right? Endless wars of any kind are generally bad. And one of the distinct differences in the regimens in place today from the textbook idea of why you do things, like put tariffs or sanctions in place, is that they've been structured to be long-term. Usually the idea is that tariffs are a redress of grievance, and once the area under the curve is made up, it closes and they're gone. The idea is that sanctions bring you to the table, and once a deal is struck, they're gone. But the Trump administration, in addition to really projecting power in a new way, has set new thresholds that I'm not sure are going to change. The Iran sanctions, for example, are not just to get a deal, but also to deprive Iran of revenue for regional aggression. In other words, can stay in force indefinitely. The tariffs, such as they are, however one wants to justify the math, are regarded as protecting a constituency that may need protection for the indefinite future, steel producers in a declining steel demand world. So what exactly makes them abate? We might be looking at the beginning of forever economic wars, or at least not a snap back. Long answer, but I'll make the last part very short. Do we end up decoupling from the second largest economy in the world? Do we end up with parallel systems? And the answer is maybe, but probably not because of this. The technology Cold War, the questions about whether there's bigger conflict issues, things that are national security rooted rather than economically rooted, could still take us there, yes. There's always room to make a bargain in the future. But again, we've started to look like a country that's going to be protectionist, and aggressive from an economic perspective for a while.
Will Frazier, National Renewable Energy Lab. I have a quick LNG question. So, given that a lot of the growth is in the Asia Pacific and most of the exporting, or all of the exporting facilities in the U.S. are in the Gulf Coast area, what would be the impact of additional exporting facilities along the Pacific coast? I just want to get a sense of what you guys think the factors are there and whether or not that is a big deal or not.
So hold on, stay right there because I'm not sure I fully understand the question. So you said additional LNG terminals along the west coast of North America?
Yeah, it's my understanding there's a few that are proposed and they're held back by permitting and whatnot. And I just want to get a sense of if this is a big deal or not. And if not, what are the factors?
So for sure, as I articulated during my prepared remarks or my slides, the overwhelming majority of demand going forward for LNG is in Asia. I'm pretty sure my graph had 70% of incremental growth going to being satisfied by Asian demand. So there certainly is an inherent advantage to being on the west coast of North America, because when we ship our product via the Gulf Coast to Asia, it goes through the Panama Canal, takes about 30 days one way, and 60 days round trip. If you're able to, for example, if I use LNG Canada, which is Shell and a few other partners, a very large development up in the Kitimat area, basically northwest BC, if I use their shipping logistics as a data point, it's about 10 days for them. So that's fairly significant savings. It's equivalent to about $1 per MMBTU. So that in a game where nickels and dimes are starting to matter more and more because of increased competition is certainly valuable. But you also have to take into consideration if you're building in Western Canada in a remote area without local labor forces, yes, you can modularize, but you still are going to have to erect your facility on site, and that does pose additional challenges that we believe, and I think you won't find too many people that will try and refute it, that building up in Western Canada is going to be more expensive than in Texas or Louisiana that has infrastructure, access to labor, et cetera. Skilled labor, by the way, because that is an important distinction. So yes, there are advantages from a logistical perspective, but do they all get washed out when you take into account the incremental cost to build up there? And then also in Western Canada, you've got to get your resources from the Montney, which is in eastern BC and western Alberta, to the coast, and that's a 500-mile pipeline that needs to traverse over the Rocky Mountains through unadulterated and pretty dense wilderness. So we're talking about some significant constraints. It's all doable, and it's certainly going to happen, and that project is already in the works. If I think about some of the other projects you may be referring to, there's another LNG project that is proposed in Oregon. And I will just say that having spent some time thinking about West Coast U.S. LNG exports, I think the political dynamics make it nearly impossible to pull something like that off, given that a state like Oregon, for example, does not support fracking. There is no resource that they're developing within their own state. They would be taking Canadian molecules and running them through their state and across a dock in their state. And there's quite a bit of opposition to doing that, as opposed to thinking more about how do you transition quickly to cleaner burning sources that don't include any hydrocarbons. So when I think about the political landscape of Washington State, Oregon, and California, those are three tough nuts to crack. And that's one of the reasons why when I show a map of all those projects that have been sanctioned and are either in operation or under construction, there's a reason why there's such a large concentration of those projects across the Gulf Coast, predominantly in Texas and Louisiana, because the environment is favorable to build those type of infrastructure projects. Sorry, that might have been a long-winded answer.
I have a philosophical question. I was struck by the history that you gentlemen presented today. In 1973, James Schlesinger was the defense secretary. He wanted to invade Saudi Arabia because of the embargo. DOE was formed in 77 in order to achieve energy security. 15 years ago, Schlesinger spoke at this conference and talked about peak oil. Now you've all talked about a hydrocarbon cornucopia. Is it time? Was Secretary Perry, when he was a Republican candidate, actually correct? Is it time, in fact, to shut down the DOE?
I'm reluctant to kill an agency, at least I can remember it and name it. But the DOE is largely a nuclear science organization, and the function it serves is substantial and necessary even without hydrocarbon trade. I think there are flavors of that question, though, that are interesting, and one of them is it still time to have a strategic petroleum reserve, which keeps coming up frequently. I've testified, I think, 4 or maybe 5 times on this topic in different forms in front of Congress with my arms on the high armrests in the low seat, looking up at the dais and hoping they don't ask me a career-ending question. And, the insurance value of government-controlled reserves pays out really well. The question, though, is how much insurance do you need, and can you actually deliver the insurance to the market that needs it? And so I think they're right to look at that, and they are. They're looking at not only what to do, but because Congress is said to sell 300 million barrels of it, what to leave behind when they're done selling. Hopefully we'll get a report, a post-sale configuration study later this year. As far as there are other functions DOE performs that are hydrocarbon relevant, the licensing of cross-border natural gas shipments under Section 3 of the Natural Gas Act, I think we would still want somebody to say yes to those things, or no, as appropriate, or at least to establish that we have licenses for exporting things, given that exporting is our business. So I'm going to say let's keep DOE, just in case.
So Peter Hartley, Rice University. I noticed you mentioned that one of the first items that was subject to tariff, exports to China subject to tariff, were the solar panels. And then sort of thinking about era of energy abundance, and you have the Democratic candidates. You're talking about maybe cutting back fracking, cutting back U.S. Oil and gas production on the one hand. On the other hand, the big supporters of renewable energy, and then noting actually that China, is a very dominant right now, at least in the short run, very dominant in critical minerals that go into these alternative energy technologies, and then also saying, that the Democratic candidates are supporting continuing a bit of pressure on China in the trade area. How do they end up squaring those particular circles?
We've all seen the cartoon where the guy's standing on the tree limb with the saw, sawing in between himself and the trunk, right? So there are real challenges with some of these policy propositions, but there's a couple of things that bear noting. First, the transition is happening at a subnational level anyway, right? So irrespective of what those candidates are saying, the 30 states and the district with renewable portfolio standards are now setting mid-century max out, 100% clean targets on their own, and some of them really intend to keep them. So that's going to prove problematic also in a world where we're constrained in critical minerals and reliant on outside supply. There's also an electric vehicle landscape evolving, perhaps slower than some would have expected, faster maybe than some might have believed, that's going to be heavily reliant on currently scarce resources. If there's anything we've learned from the lesson of the last 15 years, is that the right price signal will get an answer. And the question of whether U.S. policy can accommodate the production of molecules from some other place, which might also have hair on it, becomes probably more relevant. No, we're not necessarily buying Greenland yet, although I think if we get a good price, it might be worth the investment. But in practice, those transition strategies are constrained seriously, and the Trump administration is looking at that. They've actually taken on essentially a critical mineral governance standard project. I forget the proper name of it, but Secretary Pompeo vetted it a couple of months ago, and the idea was to actually look at precisely this, the increased reliance on these as part of our renewable and alternative base, and how to ensure that the production comports with our values. Anybody else want to say anything on this, by the way?
One of the interesting things in reviewing some of the statements that Democratic candidates have made is the requirements that they have placed upon the country and extrapolate to the globe is far in excess of what's actually required to meet the thresholds of temperature rise. And so you don't have to do it. So then you're just beating yourself against the wall for no good reason and to no good end. And so that generally doesn't work out in a connected global economic scheme as well. And so I think Hickenlooper's out of the race now. He sort of seemed to understand the balance of all that, but I'm hoping some sanity returns to the presidential candidate field. We've been showing a lot of folks the IEA two new scenarios they came out with this year. The new policy scenario, which seems to meet a lot of the climate change questions, and the sustainable development scenario, which meets the goals of Paris, but even beyond that allows everybody to have access to water and electricity. And so I think when you look at the actual fuel use under those scenarios that they've calculated, we can do that as a planet. And we can do it without totally destroying the largest economy in the world. So I'm hopeful that that maybe with the help of a strong and smart DOE, the candidates will get this straight.
I don't have anything to add.
Hi, Aaron Anibal from the Embassy of Canada in Washington, D.C. So I won't do so here, but if anyone wants to talk about LNG on the BC coast, I probably have some different perspectives than Oliver, so happy to do that. But my question is for Kevin and Dean, perhaps, if either of you have any thoughts on the prospects for USMCA in Congress amid some potential distractions and also a potentially narrowing window.
I'm just going to set the record straight here. I don't want you to think that exports out of BC don't work. I mean, we do think they're competitive and makes sense. It just comes with some other challenges. That's all. Okay.
And so the question of USMCA, I think implicit in your question, Aaron, is the impeachment inquiry ongoing in Washington, which I think it's possible that most normal people, I'm not sure a conference of energy economists qualifies as normal people, but most normal people probably don't realize just exactly how messy things are about to get. And yet, in spite of how messy they are about to get, and when I say that, you should think about this. There was a vote last week where the House voted on essentially the rules of order for the impeachment, and all 190 Republican votes were nay. Right? This is a complete division. This is going to stress our constitutional framework just a little bit. So when you ask, can ordinary cooperation get by? The answer is no. Ordinary cooperation cannot get by. So there are things people have been waiting for in Washington. The biodiesel folks have been patiently waiting for their biodiesel tax credit, their blender's tax credit to come back. Disappeared, hasn't been back. There's solar credits that folks now want extended after not wanting them extended. Can this happen? No, probably not. It's really hard to get that kind of cooperation in this kind of mess. But USMCA is a little bit different. One of the things the Democrats don't want to do is they don't want to distract from what they are doing, which is that they're getting America to focus on impeachment. Doing things like shutting the government down or looking obstructionist on trade or creating talking points that can divert the dialogue would be unhelpful. So, in fact, strategically, they have every reason to at least work towards a solution on USMCA and only in absolute danger break that glass. Our contention is that they will, in fact, proceed and get it done.
So I alluded to this during the opening comments, we're hopeful that it will pass. And we have a federal relations group that interacts on the Hill an awful lot. And it's just really hard to read the tea leaves on exactly when it will find space on the floor to come to a vote, and again, requiring this bipartisan support to go across the finish line. The timing is important. The optics are important. And if the circumstances with government shutdown, with impeachment, with all the other things that are looming out there, if that pushes into next year, it becomes harder as you kick that can down the road to reach that consensus. So we're hopeful that it has the critical mass to kind of get there, but it's not done yet. So watch this space. Mark?
Just a half a intervention there. If it fails, does it revert to NAFTA, or does it take us all the way back to square one?
So Article 2205 of NAFTA requires 6 months' notice before blowing up NAFTA. The president has threatened to do it, but has not done it. It would be disastrous if he did it at a time when there was, in fact, no political wherewithal to pass USMCA. So the window for pulling the trigger on that time bomb, lighting the fuse on that time bomb, setting the clock, I need a metaphor intervention here, please. Setting that time bomb off is probably closing, if not already closed. So NAFTA would remain in force.
I think I heard on the news last night that Speaker Pelosi has come out in favor of passing it.
She said that. She still has to do it, right? So, but she has said, again, for the reason I named. She doesn't. If you're trying to keep the spotlight on impeachment, the last thing you want to do is look at what we're not doing that really matters.
Okay. And with that, we've reached our time commitment for the session. I appreciate really the great interaction and questions, and I want to thank all the panelists. Thank you so much for excellent presentations, excellent answers. If you have questions afterwards, we're free to answer. Thank you.